The morning came faster than Miguel expected, or maybe he'd just stopped noticing time passing. At row 445, he was standing in the operations center watching multiple screens showing different teams getting into position. Some were local, preparing to execute arrest warrants on corrupt officers. Others showed grainy night vision footage from teams across the border in Mexico, surrounding compounds where hostages might be held. Captain Richard Thornton arrived at exactly 500, escorted by 2 federal agents. He looked older than Miguel remembered, more tired, like he'd been carrying an impossible weight for too long. He was brought into a private room where Agent Reeves, Captain Morales, and Miguel were waiting. "Captain Thornton," Reeves said, her voice professional but not unkind. "Please sit down. We have something important to discuss with you." Thornton sat, his eyes moving between the 3 of them, trying to read the situation. "Am I under arrest?" "That depends on the next 10 minutes, Morales said. "We know about Isabella." The color drained from Thornton's face. For a moment, Miguel thought the captain might pass out. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles turning white. "You," he started, then stopped, his voice breaking. "You can't. If they find out, if they think I talked, they'll kill her." "We found their intelligence cache," Reeves explained, sliding some of the photographs across the table. "All of it. The surveillance photos, the financial records, the communications. We know they've been holding your daughter and using her to force you to cooperate. We know you've been feeding them information for 2 years. Thornton stared at the photos, and Miguel saw something break inside him. The strong, confident captain he'd known was gone, replaced by a father who'd been living in hell for 2 years, torn between his duty and his daughter's life. "I had no choice," Thornton whispered. "They sent me pictures. Pictures of her, alive but scared. They said if I didn't help them, they'd send her back to me in pieces." "What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to report it," Morales said, though his tone wasn't harsh. "You should have come to us. We could have helped. Could you?" Thornton looked up, and there was anguish in his eyes. "Really? How many rescue operations across the border have succeeded? How many hostages have we recovered alive?" I looked at the statistics. I knew the odds, and I couldn't risk my daughter's life on those odds. Agent Reeves leaned forward. "Captain, at 05:15 we're executing coordinated operations on both sides of the border. We're raiding 3 compounds in Mexico, where we believe hostages are being held. We're arresting cartel members and corrupt law enforcement officers across Texas. And we're going to bring your daughter home, but we need your help. We need you to tell us everything you know about their operations, their communication methods, their locations. If I talk, they'll know. They always know." "They won't have time to know," Miguel said, speaking for the first time. "Everything happens simultaneously. By the time anyone realizes we're moving, it'll be too late for them to react. But we need your information to make sure we're hitting the right targets." Thornton looked at Miguel for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "What do you want to know?" For the next 10 minutes, Thornton talked. He described how the cartels had first approached him after Isabella disappeared, how they'd shown him proof of life and made their demands. He provided details about drop sites, communication protocols, and the names of other officers he knew were compromised. Some were being coerced like him. Others, he admitted with visible shame, were in it for the money and didn't seem to care about the damage they were causing. At 05:15, Agent Reeves received a signal on her radio. "All teams are go. Operations commencing now." On the screens in the main operations center, Miguel watched as simultaneous raids began. In Texas, teams moved to arrest corrupt officers, catching most of them at home before they'd even left for work. The arrests were quick, professional, designed to minimize risk. Most suspects surrendered immediately when faced with multiple armed officers and FBI agents. The raids in Mexico were more intense. The night vision footage showed teams breaching compounds, moving through buildings with military precision. Gunfire erupted at one location, brief but intense, before the shooting stopped and the team called in that the area was secure. "Team 3 reports hostages recovered," came a voice over the radio. 4 females alive and responsive. "Medical team moving in." Thornton's head snapped up. "Is one of them Isabella? Is my daughter there?" They waited. 10 seconds stretching into a minute, then 2. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Team 3 confirms Isabella Thornton is among the recovered hostages. She's alive. Appears to be in good health considering circumstances. She's asking about her father." Thornton broke. The tough veteran captain put his head in his hands and sobbed like a child. Miguel looked away, giving the man a moment of privacy in what was probably the most emotional moment of his life. The operations continued for the next 2 hours. In total, they recovered Isabella Thornton, a sheriff's son who'd been held for 3 years, a border agent's wife, and a teenage girl who turned out to be the DEA agent's daughter. All 4 were alive, traumatized but physically unharmed. The cartels had kept them alive because they were more valuable that way, insurance policies to guarantee cooperation. The arrests were equally successful. 47 suspects were taken into custody, including 23 cartel members and 14 law enforcement officers who were actively corrupt. The 10 officers who were being coerced, like Thornton, were placed in protective custody pending further investigation. The cartel leader, a man known only as El Espina, was captured at a ranch just across the border. He'd been coordinating the entire network, building his intelligence operation for years. When federal police raided his location, they found rooms full of documents, computers containing detailed records of operations, and enough evidence to put him away for multiple lifetimes. Miguel watched it all unfold from the operations center, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. It was over. Not perfectly, not without complications, but it was over. The network was broken. The hostages were free. The corrupt officers would face justice. 6 weeks later, Miguel stood in a courtroom watching as El Espina was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The man showed no emotion as the judge read the sentence, just stared straight ahead like he'd expected nothing less. 19 other cartel members received similar sentences. The remaining 4 agreed to testify against the network and received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. The corrupt law enforcement officers faced their own reckoning. The 14 who'd taken money and provided information for profit were convicted on various charges ranging from corruption to conspiracy to traffic narcotics. Their sentences varied, but even the lightest was 10 years in federal prison. Their badges, their careers, their reputations all gone. Captain Thornton's case was more complicated. The prosecutors understood that he'd been coerced, that he'd acted under extreme duress to save his daughter's life, but he'd still compromised investigations, leaked sensitive information, and put other officers at risk. In the end, he pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received a sentence of 3 years in a minimum security facility. His lawyer argued it could have been worse, and legally that was true. But watching the captain be led away in handcuffs was still one of the hardest things Miguel had ever witnessed. Isabella Thornton recovered slowly. She spent weeks in counseling, dealing with the trauma of 2 years in captivity. But she was strong, resilient, and she had her father's determination. She testified at the trials, helping to ensure that everyone involved in her kidnapping received maximum sentences. Her bravery in facing her captors in court earned her respect from everyone in law enforcement. The other rescued hostages had similar journeys. Some recovered faster than others. All of them had scars, some visible, some not. But they were alive, they were free, and they were survivors. Miguel was promoted to sergeant and received commendations from the FBI, Border Patrol, and the Texas Rangers. He was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the case, about the importance of following instincts and investigating things that seemed out of place. The bullet-riddled patrol truck he'd driven during the chase was eventually put on display at the Rangers Museum as a reminder of the day's events, but the award that meant the most to him was something much simpler. It was a handwritten note from Isabella Thornton, delivered to his office about 3 months after the rescue. It simply said, "Thank you for being curious about a strange cactus. You saved my life. I won't forget." 1 year after the operation, Miguel returned to the spot where he'd found that barrel cactus. The plant was dead now, destroyed when he'd cut into it, weathered by another year of desert heat and cold. He stood there for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened, all the lives that had been changed by that one moment of curiosity. He pulled out a small bronze plaque from his backpack, something he'd had made at his own expense. It read, "In memory of all those who suffered under corruption and in honor of those who fought to expose it. Sometimes the biggest truths hide in the smallest places." Miguel secured the plaque to a nearby rock formation, positioning it so anyone who passed by would see it. It wasn't much, not compared to everything that had happened, but it felt important to mark the spot somehow, to remember. As he walked back to his truck, his radio crackled with routine chatter. Another day of patrols, another shift protecting the border and the people who lived nearby. It was ordinary work, the kind that usually passed without incident or recognition. But Miguel had learned something important that day in the desert. Sometimes ordinary work leads to extraordinary results. Sometimes a routine patrol changes everything. And sometimes, the difference between corruption, continuing, and justice being served comes down to one person being curious enough to investigate something that doesn't look quite right. He climbed into his new truck and headed back toward the road. The desert stretched out around him, vast and ancient and full of secrets. Most of those secrets would stay buried in the sand and rock. But some, like the one hidden in that cactus, would be found by someone paying attention, someone willing to trust their instincts and follow through even when it would be easier to look the other way. Miguel Santos had been that someone, and because he'd stopped to investigate a strange bulge on a cactus one hot July afternoon, 4 hostages were freed, a criminal network was destroyed, and dozens of lives were changed forever. The desert kept its secrets well, but not always forever. Sometimes, just sometimes, someone comes along who's curious enough to dig a little deeper, to ask questions, to cut open a cactus and see what's inside. And sometimes that curiosity changes everything. As the sun set behind him, painting the desert in familiar shades of orange and gold, Miguel thought about all the other cacti out there, all the other secrets waiting to be discovered. His job would continue, the patrols would go on, and somewhere out there, maybe someone else would notice something that didn't quite look right, and maybe they'd be curious enough to investigate. Maybe they'd trust their instincts. Maybe they'd find something that changes everything, just like Miguel had. The desert had taught him that lesson well, and it was one he'd carry with him for the rest of his career. Stay curious, pay attention, trust your gut, and never walk past something strange without taking a closer look, because you never know what secrets might be hiding in plain sight. The operations center had been set up in a secure facility about an hour outside of the city. Miguel arrived at dawn after managing only 3 hours of sleep on a cot in one of the back rooms. The place was buzzing with activity, dozens of agents and officers from various agencies working shoulder to shoulder, united by a common purpose even if they didn't always agree on methods. Agent Reeves found him as soon as he walked in, looking like she hadn't slept at all. "We've made progress. Come see this." She led him to a large wall covered in photographs, documents, and maps, all connected by red string like something out of a detective movie. But this wasn't fiction. Every connection represented real people, real crimes, real lives at stake. "We've identified 47 individuals connected to this network," Reeves explained, pointing to different sections of the wall. 23 are cartel members operating on both sides of the border. 14 are law enforcement officers we believe are actively corrupt, taking money to provide information and protection. And 10, she paused, her finger landing on a separate group of photos, are officers we believe are being coerced through threats to their families. Miguel studied the faces. Some he recognized immediately, others were strangers. But they all had one thing in common. They were caught up in something that had grown far bigger than any of them probably imagined when it started. "How do you know who's dirty and who's being forced?" he asked. "We don't, not with absolute certainty," Reeves admitted. "But we've been cross-referencing the financial records with the surveillance photos and the threatening notes in the files. Some officers have been receiving regular payments for years. Others have no unusual financial activity, but their families have been photographed, followed, and there are explicit threats documented in the cartel's records." She pointed to one photo in particular. Captain Richard Thornton. Beneath his photo was a picture of a young woman, maybe 25 years old, with dark hair and a bright smile. "That's his daughter, Isabella. She disappeared 2 years ago while studying abroad in Mexico. The official report said she'd gone hiking and never returned, presumed dead, but we found references to her in the cartel's documents. They're calling her La Garantía, the guarantee." Miguel felt sick. "They've been holding her this whole time?" "We think so. And probably using her to control Thornton. Look at the timeline." Reeves pulled up a document on her tablet. "Isabella disappeared in March 2 years ago. 3 weeks later, Thornton starts providing information to the cartels. Not big stuff at first, just minor details about patrol schedules and routine operations. But over time, it escalated. The more they proved they could trust him, the more valuable information they demanded. Where is she? That's what we're trying to figure out. The documents reference several locations, but they use code names. We've got analysts working on breaking the codes, and we've got informants on both sides of the border trying to gather intelligence. But it's slow work, and we're racing against the clock. Miguel understood the urgency. The longer this took, the greater the chance that word would leak. Someone would notice unusual activity, would realize that law enforcement was asking questions they shouldn't be asking, and when that happened, the cartels would start eliminating evidence. That meant killing witnesses, destroying documents, and very possibly killing hostages who were no longer useful. What about the other families being held? Miguel asked. Reeves scrolled through her tablet. We've identified at least 3 other possible hostage situations. A sheriff's son who supposedly moved to California 3 years ago, but hasn't been heard from since. A border agent's wife who's allegedly living with relatives in Mexico, but no one can seem to reach her. And a DEA agent's teenage daughter who's supposedly at a boarding school in Arizona. But when we checked, the school has no record of her. How did they manage this without anyone noticing? Miguel asked, though he already knew the answer. People see what they expect to see. If someone says their kid moved away, got a job in another state, is traveling, most people accept that at face value. The cartels had been smart about it, choosing victims whose absence could be explained away without raising too many questions. Captain Morales walked over, holding a coffee cup and looking exhausted. We've got teams coordinating with Mexican federal police. They're preparing to raid 3 suspected compounds where hostages might be held. But it's delicate. We can't trust local police in those areas because we don't know who's compromised. Everything has to go through federal channels, and even then we're being careful. When do we move? Miguel asked. 72 hours, Agent Reeves said. We need that time to get all our people in position, confirm locations, and coordinate the timing. Everything has to happen simultaneously. The arrests here, the raids there, all of it at once so nobody has time to warn anyone else. 72 hours is a long time to keep this quiet, Rodriguez said, joining the group. He'd been working with a team analyzing the financial records, tracking money flows from the cartels to compromised officers. It is, Morales agreed, which is why we're implementing strict communication protocols. No phones, no emails, nothing that can be intercepted. All coordination happens face-to-face or through secure channels. And we're limiting who knows what. Most of the officers involved in the raids won't know the full scope of the operation until just before we move. Miguel spent the next 3 days living at the operations center, barely sleeping, working around the clock with teams of investigators and analysts. They built detailed profiles of every target, mapped out raid locations, identified escape routes, and potential complications. It was methodical, exhausting work, but it was necessary. The hardest part was figuring out how to approach the compromised officers. The ones taking money were straightforward. They'd be arrested like any other criminals. But the ones being coerced, like Thornton, presented a difficult choice. Were they victims or accomplices? Did they deserve prosecution or protection? Agent Reeves made the call. We approached them carefully. We explained that we know about the hostages, that we're working to free them. We give them a chance to cooperate fully, to provide information that will help us take down the cartels. If they do, we'll consider reduced charges or immunity depending on their level of involvement. If they refuse, they get treated like any other corrupt cop. On the evening of the 3rd day, Reeves called a meeting of all senior personnel involved in the operation. The room was packed with federal agents, state police, Texas Rangers, and Border Patrol officers. Miguel found a spot along the back wall, watching as Reeves stepped up to a podium. Ladies and gentlemen, Operation Desert Thorn goes active at 500 tomorrow morning. That's less than 8 hours from now. You all know your assignments. You all know the stakes. But I want to remind everyone of something important. She paused, looking around the room at all the determined faces. Some of the people we're going after tomorrow are law enforcement officers. People who wore the same uniforms we wear, took the same oaths we took. That's hard. That's going to mess with your head. But remember, they made their choices. And some of them made those choices to save the people they love. Our job tomorrow is to end this, to free those hostages, to stop this corruption, and to do it right. We follow the rules. We document everything. We give everyone a chance to surrender peacefully. But make no mistake, if they fight, we fight back. The room was silent. everyone absorbing the weight of what was about to happen. Captain Thornton will be brought in at 500, Reeves continued. He'll be informed about the rescue operation for his daughter and given a chance to cooperate. Assuming he does, he'll be kept in protective custody throughout the operation. The same approach will be used with the other potentially coerced officers. For those we believe are actively corrupt and working with the cartels for money, we'll execute arrest warrants simultaneously at 0515. Miguel listened as she went through the operational details, the teams assigned to each location, the backup plans if things went wrong. It was professional, thorough, exactly what you'd expect from a multi-agency task force. But beneath the professional veneer, there was tension. Everyone in that room knew that tomorrow would be dangerous, complicated, and possibly deadly. After the briefing ended, Miguel found himself outside again, staring up at the stars. The desert night was cool and clear, peaceful in a way that felt completely disconnected from what was about to happen. Can't sleep either. It was Captain Morales standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. Too wired, Miguel admitted. Keep running through everything in my head, wondering what I missed. You did good work, Santos. That cactus you found following your instincts, that's going to save lives tomorrow. I hope so. But people might die too, and some good officers are going to have their lives destroyed. Morales nodded slowly. Yeah, but that's not on you. They made their choices, or the cartels made those choices for them. All we can do is try to make it right. They stood in silence for a while, two law enforcement officers on the eve of one of the biggest operations either had ever been part of. Tomorrow would bring arrests, raids, hopefully rescues. It would bring an end to a network of corruption that had operated in the shadows for years. Miguel thought about Captain Thornton, about how he would react when they told him they knew about his daughter, that they were going to try to bring her home. Would he be relieved, angry, terrified that the cartel would kill her before they could reach her? He thought about Isabella Thornton, held captive for 2 years, used as leverage to control her father. What had those years been like for her? What would it be like for her to suddenly be free, to discover that her father had compromised his oath and his honor to try to keep her alive? He thought about all the officers who'd been corrupted, whether by greed or fear. Their careers were over. Some would go to prison. Their families would suffer. The department would be forever changed. But he also thought about the alternative. If he'd walked past that cactus, if he hadn't investigated, if he'd been just a little less curious or a little more tired, this would have continued. More operations would have been compromised. More drugs would have flowed across the border. More people would have been hurt. And eventually, probably inevitably, someone would have died because of information that was leaked to the cartels. 72 hours ago, I was just doing a routine patrol, Miguel said quietly. Now I'm part of something that's going to be in history books. Sometimes that's how it happens, Morales replied. The biggest moments start with the smallest decisions. You decided to check out that cactus. Everything else followed from that. Miguel checked his watch. 2,200 hours. 7 hours until Operation Desert Thorn began. Lieutenant Chen was the first to reach him, a stern-faced man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years with Border Patrol. He looked at Miguel's shot-up truck, then at Miguel himself, then at the metal container clutched under the ranger's arm. You okay, Santos? Miguel nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. I'm alive. That counts for something. What the hell did you find out there? Miguel looked around at the gathered officers. Easily 24 people now, more arriving every minute. He lowered his voice. Not here. Too many years. We need somewhere secure, and we need to be very careful about who we bring into this conversation. Chen's expression hardened. He'd been doing this job long enough to understand what Miguel was implying. My office. 20 minutes. Bring whoever you absolutely trust and nobody else. The drive back to the regional headquarters felt surreal. Miguel followed Chen's vehicle in a borrowed truck, his own needing a tow and probably a trip to the junkyard. The adrenaline was completely gone now, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made every mile feel like 10. His mind kept replaying the chase, the bullets, the moment he'd opened that container and seen those photographs. Headquarters was a low, modern building just outside of town, all concrete and glass trying to look official in a landscape that couldn't care less about human authority. Miguel had been here hundreds of times, filed countless reports, sat through endless meetings. But walking through those doors now, carrying evidence that could blow apart everything he thought he knew about his department, Felt like entering enemy territory. Chen had kept his word about keeping the circle small. When Miguel entered the lieutenant's office, there were only 3 other people waiting. Rodriguez, his patrol partner, who looked worried and confused. Agent Patricia Reeves from the FBI, a woman Miguel had worked with on a couple of cross-border cases and had found to be sharp and trustworthy. And Captain Vincent Morales from the state police, a by-the-book officer who'd built his reputation on taking down corrupt cops. "Close the door," Chen said. Miguel did. Then set the container on the conference table in the middle of the room. 4 pairs of eyes locked onto it like it might explode at any moment. "Before I open this," Miguel said, "I need everyone here to understand something. What's inside this box is going to change everything. It's going to make you question people you've worked with for years. It's going to make you paranoid about who you can trust. And once we go down this road, there's no going back. Just show us," Agent Reeves said quietly. Miguel opened the container and started pulling out documents, spreading them across the table. The maps came first, showing the border region marked with coordinates and coded notations. Then the photographs, dozens of them. Law enforcement officers going about their daily routines, completely unaware they were under surveillance. Rodriguez picked up one of the photos and his face went pale. "That's Captain Thornton. That's his house. I've been there for barbecues. Keep looking," Miguel said grimly. There were more photos, sheriffs from 3 different counties, border patrol agents, DEA officers. Some of the pictures showed the officers with their families. Others showed them at work. A few showed them in compromising situations, meetings that looked innocent but were probably anything but. The documents were worse. Financial records showing large cash deposits into offshore accounts. Transcripts of phone conversations that made it clear information was flowing from law enforcement to the cartels. Shipment schedules that had been adjusted after law enforcement raids were planned. It was systematic, organized, and it had clearly been going on for years. "How long have they been building this network?" Captain Morales asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Based on these dates," Agent Reeves said, flipping through papers, "at least 3 years. Maybe longer." Chen slumped into his chair. 3 years? How did we miss this?" "Because they were smart," Miguel said. "Look at the pattern. They never compromised too many people in one department. They spread it out, kept everyone isolated so nobody could see the full picture, and they chose their targets carefully. People with access to sensitive information but not so high profile that their corruption would draw attention." Rodriguez was staring at a transcript of a phone call. "This is from 6 months ago. It's warning someone about a raid we were planning on a safe house. The raid came up empty. We thought our intelligence was just bad." "It wasn't bad," Miguel said. "It was leaked." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Every failed operation, every missed arrest, every time the cartels seemed to be one step ahead. It might not have been luck or superior planning. It might have been betrayal from within. Agent Reeves pulled out her phone. "I need to call this in to headquarters. We're going to need a task force, probably multiple agencies involved. This is going to be a massive investigation." "Wait," Miguel said, and something in his tone made everyone look at him. He picked up a specific photograph from the table, one he'd noticed earlier but hadn't fully processed. It showed Captain Richard Thornton again, but this time he was standing in what looked like a parking garage talking to a man Miguel didn't recognize. The timestamp on the photo was from just 2 weeks ago. "What is it?" Chen asked. Miguel pointed to the notation on the back of the photo. It was in Spanish, but the meaning was clear enough. "Insurance policy," he translated. "That's what they're calling these photos. And this one specifically has a note that says family location confirmed. Understanding dawned on everyone's faces at roughly the same time. These weren't just surveillance photos. They were leverage. The cartels weren't necessarily paying all these officers. Some of them might be cooperating because they had no choice, because someone they loved was being used as a guarantee of good behavior. "We need to move carefully," Captain Morales said. "If we go in hard, start making arrests, people might get hurt. Hostages might get killed. But if we don't move fast," Rodriguez countered, "the cartels are going to realize we have this information. They'll clean house, destroy evidence, maybe kill the compromised officers to eliminate loose ends." Agent Reeves was already typing on her phone. "I'm calling in a tactical team. We're going to need to coordinate simultaneous operations on both sides of the border. Rescue operations for any hostages, arrests for the cartel members, and very careful interviews with the compromised officers to figure out who's corrupt and who's being coerced. Miguel sat down, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years. This is going to tear apart the department. The department is already torn apart, Chen said. We just didn't know it. At least now we can start fixing it. Over the next hour, the small office turned into a command center. More people arrived, but Chen and Agent Reeves were ruthless about vetting each one before allowing them access to the evidence. Everyone had to be vouched for by multiple people, and even then, they were watched carefully for any sign of nervousness or suspicious behavior. A task force was assembled, drawing personnel from agencies across the state and federal system. The FBI took the lead, with the Texas Rangers and Border Patrol providing support. The DEA was brought in because of the drug trafficking connections. Even Mexican federal police were contacted, though very carefully, since corruption extended on both sides of the border. Miguel found himself at the center of it all, the man who'd stumbled onto the evidence, the one who could speak to exactly how and where he'd found it. He walked investigators through every detail of his discovery, describing the cactus, the container, the chase. His bullet-riddled truck was photographed from every angle, documented as evidence of how serious the cartels were about protecting their network. As evening fell, Miguel stood outside headquarters, finally getting a breath of fresh air. The desert sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and indifferent to the human drama playing out below. Rodriguez came out and stood beside him, offering a cup of coffee. "Hell of a day," Rodriguez said. "Hell of a day," Miguel agreed. "You think Thornton is corrupt or coerced?" Miguel had been thinking about that question for hours. Captain Richard Thornton was a 30-year veteran, a man Miguel had looked up to since joining the Rangers. The idea that he was dirty was almost impossible to accept, but the evidence was there, undeniable. "I don't know," Miguel admitted. "I hope he's being blackmailed. I hope there's a good reason. But hoping doesn't change the facts. What happens now?" Miguel took a sip of coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through him. "Now we go to war. A quiet war, a careful war, but a war nonetheless. We're going to take apart this network piece by piece, and we're going to do it fast before they realize just how much trouble they're in." Inside, he could see through the windows as agents and officers worked at laptops, pinning photos to boards, making phone calls to coordinate with other agencies. It looked like organized chaos, but there was a purpose to it, a momentum building. They were preparing for multiple simultaneous operations, planning rescues and raids that would have to happen at exactly the same time to prevent the cartels from reacting. Miguel's phone buzzed. It was a message from Agent Reeves. "Need you back inside. We've identified possible hostage locations. Your input on the geography would be valuable." He drained his coffee and headed back in. The sun had set completely now, and the desert was dark. But inside that building, under artificial lights, people were working through the night. They were building a case, planning operations, preparing to strike at a criminal network that had operated in the shadows for too long. Miguel thought about that cactus again, sitting out in the desert with its strange bulge. If he just walked past it, dismissed it as nothing important, none of this would be happening. The network would still be operating. The corruption would still be hidden. People would still be in danger. Sometimes the biggest cases started with the smallest observations. A strange-looking cactus on a hot afternoon, a Texas Ranger curious enough to investigate, a metal container full of secrets that nobody was supposed to find. And now, because of that curiosity, dozens of law enforcement agencies were mobilizing for what would likely become one of the largest anti-cartel operations in recent Texas history. Miguel's boots pounded against the hard desert ground as he sprinted toward his patrol truck. The container felt like it weighed 100 pounds, even though he knew it was maybe 20 at most. Fear has a way of making everything heavier. His truck was parked about 200 yards away, hidden behind a rocky outcrop where he'd left it earlier that morning. 200 yards had never seemed so far. Behind him, the sound of engines grew louder. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The three SUVs were closing the distance fast, throwing up huge clouds of dust as they tore across the desert. They weren't on any road. They were driving straight at him, and they clearly didn't care about the rough terrain or what might be in their way. Miguel's lungs burned, but he pushed harder. He could see his truck now, the white and tan paint job that marked it as Texas Department of Public Safety. It looked beautiful. It looked like survival. He fumbled for his keys as he ran, nearly dropping them when his sweaty fingers couldn't get a good grip. 50 yards. 40. 30. The first gunshot cracked through the air, and Miguel dove behind a large boulder, his shoulder hitting the ground hard. The container skidded across the dirt beside him. That answered any question about whether these people were serious. They were very serious, and they were very willing to kill a Texas Ranger in broad daylight to protect whatever secrets were in that metal box. Miguel drew his weapon and tried to catch his breath. He needed to think. His truck was 20 yards away, but between him and it was open ground with no cover. The SUVs were less than a quarter mile out now, and they were spreading out trying to flank him. These weren't amateurs. They moved with military precision, coordinating their approach to cut off any escape route. His radio crackled again. "Santos, what's your situation?" "I heard gunfire." "I'm pinned down," Miguel said, trying to keep his voice calm. 3 vehicles, multiple armed suspects. "They're not here to talk. Where's that backup?" 15 minutes out. State Police and Border Patrol are both responding. "Can you hold?" Miguel looked at the SUVs, now close enough that he could see the sun glinting off their chrome bumpers. 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. "I'm going to have to move. Tell them to track my vehicle if they can. I'm not waiting around to see how good these guys' aim is." He didn't give Rodriguez time to argue. Miguel grabbed the container, took 3 deep breaths, and then ran. His legs pumped as hard as they could, zigzagging slightly to make himself a harder target. More gunshots rang out, and he heard bullets whining past him, kicking up dirt just feet away. His truck was right there, 10 yards, 5 yards. And then his hand was on the door handle, and he was yanking it open. He threw the container across to the passenger seat and dove in behind it, keeping his head low. The engine roared to life on the first try, and Miguel sent up a silent thank you to whatever deity watches over Texas Rangers. He slammed the transmission into drive and floored it, not bothering with his seatbelt. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. The rear window exploded. Safety glass showered over him as a bullet punched through, and Miguel ducked lower, steering as much by instinct as by sight. He could barely see over the dashboard, but he knew this desert. He knew where the paths were, where the ground was solid enough to handle a heavy vehicle at high speed. The SUVs fell in behind him, and the chase was on. Miguel's truck was tough, built for rough terrain and long patrols, but it wasn't meant for high-speed pursuits. The SUVs behind him were newer, faster, and there were 3 of them. His only advantage was knowing the land. He'd patrolled this area for 15 years. Every rock formation, every wash, every treacherous patch of soft sand was mapped in his memory. He yanked the wheel hard to the left, sending the truck skidding around a cluster of boulders that he knew was there. One of the SUVs tried to follow and had to brake hard, losing precious seconds. 2 down. 1 still right on his tail. Miguel's phone was ringing. He grabbed it without taking his eyes off the terrain ahead. "What?" "It's Lieutenant Chen from Border Patrol. We've got 2 helicopters in the air heading your way. What's your location?" Miguel rattled off coordinates while swerving to avoid a deep wash that would have swallowed his truck whole. "I've got 3 vehicles pursuing, armed and dangerous. They've already fired on me multiple times. And Chen, whatever you do, secure this line. I've got information here that suggests we've got compromised officers. I don't know who to trust." There was a pause on the other end. "Say again?" "You heard me. I found cartel intelligence. Surveillance photos of law enforcement, including people in our department. Until we figure out who's clean and who's dirty, we keep this quiet." Another bullet took out his side mirror, and Miguel jerked the wheel right, putting a rocky hill between him and his pursuers for a few precious seconds. He used the cover to push his truck even harder, the suspension screaming as he bounced over rough ground. "Understood," Chen said, his voice tight. "Choppers are 12 minutes out. Can you make it?" "I'm going to try." The SUVs crested the hill behind him, and now all 3 were back in pursuit. They'd learned from their mistake and were staying together, overwhelming him with numbers. Miguel's truck wasn't going to outrun them forever. The engine was already starting to overheat, the temperature gauge climbing into the red. He'd been pushing it too hard for too long. He needed a plan. Running wasn't going to work. He couldn't outgun them, couldn't outrun them. What did that leave? He racked his brain, thinking through every tactical training session, every scenario he'd practiced. Then it hit him. The old ranch road. About 3 miles ahead, there was an abandoned ranch property. The access road was narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle, and it ran between two high rock walls for about a quarter-mile. If he could get there first, get through it, the SUVs would have to follow single file. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them down, break up their coordinated attack. And maybe, just maybe, it would buy him enough time for those helicopters to arrive. Miguel changed course, angling toward where he knew the ranch road was. His truck groaned in protest, but it kept going. Behind him, the SUVs matched his turn, still coming, still firing occasionally. They were conserving ammunition now, smart enough to know they'd catch him eventually. The entrance to the ranch road appeared ahead, marked by 2 weathered fence posts and a rusted cattle guard. Miguel hit it at 40 miles per hour, and the truck bucked violently as it crossed the metal grating. The narrow passage opened up ahead of him, rock walls rising 10 feet high on either side. It was like driving through a canyon, and it was exactly what he needed. He pushed through, his mirrors nearly scraping the rock walls. The sound of his engine echoed loudly in the confined space. Behind him, he heard the first SUV hit the cattle guard, then saw it in what remained of his rearview mirror, struggling to fit through the narrow passage. They were following, but they were slowing down. They had to. Miguel kept his foot down, racing through the passage as fast as he dared. A crash here would be catastrophic. The wall's too close to allow any room for error, but he'd driven this road before years ago when the ranch was still operational. He knew it straightened out after about a quarter-mile, knew it would dump him out onto a wider service road that led back toward the highway. The rock walls finally opened up, and Miguel burst out into open desert again. He immediately cut left, then right, then left again, making himself unpredictable. The first SUV emerged from the passage behind him, then the second, then the third. They'd made it through, but he'd gained some distance. Maybe 100 yards. Not much, but something. That's when he heard it. The beautiful mechanical sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Miguel's eyes scanned the sky, and there they were. 2 Border Patrol helicopters coming in fast and low from the east. The SUVs saw them too. Miguel watched in his broken mirror as the lead vehicle suddenly braked, then turned hard. The other 2 followed suit, and within seconds all 3 were racing away from him, scattering in different directions like cockroaches when you turn on a light. The helicopters didn't pursue them. Their priority was Miguel, making sure the officer was safe. One of them swooped down alongside his truck, and through the open windows, Miguel could see the pilot giving him a thumbs-up signal. Miguel finally eased off the gas, letting his battered truck slow to something approaching a reasonable speed. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was starting to wear off. He became aware of a dozen different aches and pains, probably from all the rough driving and the dive behind that boulder. His ears were ringing from the gunshots. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, but he was alive. And more importantly, he still had the container. He followed the helicopter's guidance to a landing zone about 5 miles from his position, a flat stretch of desert where a convoy of law enforcement vehicles was already gathering. State police, border patrol, even a couple of unmarked federal vehicles that probably belonged to the FBI or DEA. Word had gotten out that something big was happening. Miguel pulled up and finally turned off his engine. It sputtered and died with what sounded like relief. He sat there for a moment, just breathing, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. Then he grabbed the container, opened his door, and stepped out into what felt like an entirely different world than the one he'd been in an hour ago. The sun was beating down on the West Texas desert like it had a personal grudge against anything living. Miguel Santos wiped the sweat from his forehead and squinted at the endless stretch of sand and rock ahead of him. He'd been a Texas Ranger for 15 years, and this particular patch of the Chihuahuan desert had become as familiar to him as his own backyard. But familiarity doesn't mean comfort, especially when it's pushing 105 degrees and you're miles from the nearest air-conditioned building. Miguel wasn't out here for a casual stroll. He was tracking footprints, the kind that told a story of people crossing where they shouldn't be crossing. Border patrol work was a regular part of his job, though it wasn't the exciting gunfights and showdowns that movies made it out to be. Most days it was just heat, dust, and hours of walking while keeping your eyes sharp for anything out of place. That's exactly what he was doing when he spotted it. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Heat does that sometimes, makes you see things that aren't really there. But as he got closer, he realized this wasn't a mirage. There was a massive barrel cactus about 50 yards ahead, and something about it looked wrong. Miguel had seen thousands of cacti in his years patrolling these lands. They came in all shapes and sizes, twisted and weathered by the harsh desert conditions. But this one had a bulge on its side that didn't look natural at all. It was too smooth, too rounded, like someone had stuffed a basketball under the cactus's skin. He approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving closer to his sidearm. Out here you learned to trust your gut, and his gut was telling him something wasn't right. The cactus stood about 4 feet tall, a good-sized specimen that had probably been growing for decades. The strange lump protruded from about halfway up, and as Miguel got within 10 feet of it, he could swear he saw it move. Not move like it was alive, but move like the heat waves were making it pulse. He stopped and stared at it for a long moment, running through possibilities in his mind. Could be an animal den, though that would be unusual for this type of cactus. Could be some kind of disease or growth, though he'd never seen anything like it before. Could be nothing at all, just his tired mind making mountains out of molehills after too many hours in the sun. But Miguel didn't get to be a veteran ranger by ignoring his instincts. He pulled out his radio and called in his position. Protocol said you didn't investigate suspicious findings alone, especially not out here where help could be an hour away if things went sideways. His partner Rodriguez acknowledged the call and said he'd head Miguel's direction, but it would take him at least 45 minutes to arrive. Miguel found a shaded spot behind a cluster of rocks and settled in to wait. He kept his eyes on the cactus, studying it from a distance. The more he looked at it, the more convinced he became that this wasn't natural. The bulge had defined edges, almost like something had been deliberately placed inside the plant. But how and why? 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The desert was quiet except for the occasional whisper of wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Miguel's mind wandered to the cases he'd worked over the years. The drug smugglers who'd hidden contraband in everything from fake rocks to hollowed-out fence posts. The human traffickers who'd used abandoned buildings and underground tunnels. Criminal organizations were getting more creative every year, always finding new ways to move their goods and avoid detection. At the 40-minute mark, Miguel made a decision. Rodriguez was still 5 minutes out, and sitting here staring at a cactus was driving him crazy. He stood up, stretched his legs, and walked toward the plant. He'd just take a closer look, maybe snap a few photos for the report. Nothing risky, just professional curiosity.